especially this wonderful weather we're having today, right? I know there's some people who have concerns about maybe getting back home and the roads and everything. Welcome to the Broomfield Veterans Museum. My name is Don Seigan. I'm one of the board directors here. And just to let you know, you're probably looking for Mike Fellows. He is kind of giving me a trial run here today as a coffee and conversation starter. We are very privileged to have John Steinle with us today. John is outstanding gentleman, avid historian and author with an interest in early American history. He has worked as a curator and archivist at the Cincinnati Art Museum and Cincinnati Historical Society, and as director at several Ohio museums before immigrating to Colorado. In '94, John became administrator of the Hiwan Homestead Museum in Evergreen, my hometown, and was promoted to history education supervisor and region supervisor for the Bear Creek region. John retired in 2016. Now, I've known John for a little bit. We've both been involved in the reenacting hobby with the American Military Living History Association. And I also have known John for his historical work he has done in the town of Evergreen, where many people consider him to be the resident historian of the town of Evergreen. So,
well, that's interesting since I don't live in Evergreen. Oh, well.
But you're still very widely and highly regarded there. Anyway, a couple of things that I'd like to run through quick before John starts his presentation for us today on the Silver Panic. And see if I can grab this real quick from here. Sorry, John. Yep. We seem like we're a little stuck. Huh. Let's try this. No? Exactly. Let's get out of this, and we'll try this a different way. Well, for some reason, our computer is not cooperating with us, so I will go ahead and read through this real quickly. We do have some future coffee and conversation events coming up. On May 11th, we will have Colleen Sawyer, who will tell us the story of Eleanor Roosevelt. Look forward to that one. Noah Webb will be here on May 18th. He is an Army veteran and an artist. He will share some paintings that were inspired by his service in Vietnam. On May 25th, Flint Whitlock and some guy named Don Seigan are going to give a presentation about the 80th anniversary of Operation Overlord, D-Day. Since this is the 80th anniversary of this year. Mm-hmm. We are now open on Tuesdays and Thursdays from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. Please stop by and visit the museum, browse our library. We're always looking for other veterans to share their stories. So if what you see up here is interest to you, and you have a particular story you'd like to share with the museum and with others, I'd love to hear you. Please sign the attendance sheets if you have not already. And please make sure that you turn off your cell phones. You have them on silent. We're very much in need of volunteers for the museum. If we can get you to volunteer, we would love to have you. It's a wonderful organization. Don't forget that following the talk, we have refreshments, coffee, and donuts. That's why we call this Coffee and Conversation. All right? And without any further ado, I will let John take over. So,
thank you, Don.
Thank you, John. See if we can get.
Thank you all for coming out on this beautiful, clear Colorado day. And I'm about to bring you a cheerful, uplifting message about the silver crash. A cheerful, uplifting message about death, destruction, despair, arson, murder, riot, war, violence. In other words, just a typical day in Colorado. So let's see if we can get this going. Now, some of you, like you, Bob Mulder, I'll bet you're wondering, why did I come here today to listen about this topic? We always come here to talk about military. military topic. This isn't a military topic. This is a topic about an economic crash. What? Oh, I have to turn it on? That might be good. How about that?
That's good.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Oh, sure.
Yes, good.
All right, repeat everything you said.
So, I guess what I would say to that is, if I can get this moving,
There you go.
Let's get you up on slide.
I tell you what. Wait a minute, where are we going here?
Here, let me get you.
Move the wheel.
Help me out.
We're gonna turn the PowerPoint on.
We have to go to slideshow and we have to go to beginning.
Yeah.
All right. And immediately it conks out. There we go.
We're good.
There we go. So if you're wondering why, if you're wondering if there's any military aspects to this topic, which is flashing on and off and then going off.
John, try the other button and see if that one works for you there. Sorry. Well,
Hang on just a second here.
Is there a 10-year-old kid here that can fix this?
Right there. Come on up.
No, we've got the next best thing. Here, I'll get it. So, there, yeah, that thing's not the remote. There you go.
Well, it will if, can I see that second?
Yeah. mhm.
Reboot your computer. Reboot your computer.
Well, while we're here, let me also mention I have another book besides the one on the silver crash. My book on Colorado and the silver crash, I don't have any copies with me today, but they're available only through very exclusive bookstores like Costco, Walmart, what else? Target, Barnes and Noble, Amazon, so are easily available. Anybody else need a card? Did you get one? Here we go. Anybody else? Okay, you got one? Okay.
John, while we're in a holding pattern.
Yes.
here-
What?
I'll take a look.
Oh, sure.
Thank you.
John,
And
while we're in a holding pattern here, maybe if you could tell us a little bit about, and I know you probably go into this a little bit, talk about what kind of inspired you to write this book,
well,
where that kind of muse, if you will, came from.
Well, the inspiration for this book came from my grandfather, really. My grandparents had a big book cabinet, I guess you would call it, huge. It's sitting in our house today. And in there, when I was a little kid, I used to investigate some of the books. And one of the books was called Campaign of 1908. Okay? And in this campaign book, it was a hardbound book that had detailed descriptions of all the political parties that were running candidates in the 1908 election. And one of the people they had in there was William Jennings Bryan, who, as you all know, was nominated here in Denver in 1908 for the Democratic nomination. And I said to Grandpa, "Who is this guy?" And Grandpa said, "I voted for him 3 times for president." Because I said, "Why?" And Grandpa said, "Because he always fought for the common people, the working man, against the plutocrats and capitalists and the people who are preying on the ordinary folks of America." So I thought, wow, that's interesting, and I always remembered that, and over time I began investigating William Jennings Bryan, and I thought I would write a book about the 1896 election, which is the first time that he ran unsuccessfully for president. And then I realized I had worked with Arcadia Publishing and the History Press previously with my other books, and I asked them, would you be interested in a book on the 1896 election? And they said, no, it's too limited. and you got to focus on your particular geographic area. So I thought, well, why don't I do a book on the silver crash, which was heavily involved with creating the political climate that brought William Jennings Bryan into the Democratic and Populist and Silver Republican and People's Party nomination for president. So it really started out as kind of my tribute to William Jennings Bryan. But it tells a much broader story than that, as you will see when we get going here.
And John, maybe if you can share with us a little more about how you got interested in Colorado history. I mean, besides being obviously.
Well, I live in
Colorado.
I live in Colorado.
Native, so yeah.
Well, when I moved here, I knew nothing. I moved here in 1992. I came from Ohio, thank God. I left. And people ask me, why did you leave Ohio? And I say, have you ever been in Ohio? But anyway.
I was raised in Ohio.
Well, I'm sorry. But anyway. So, are we up? Maybe. No. Anyway, so when I came here in '92, I knew absolutely nothing about Colorado history. Does Colorado even have history? You know, I thought, gee, what's with Colorado? So when you become a museum director in Colorado, you kind of have to learn a little bit about Colorado history. So that's what kind of got me started. And I realized over time how fascinating, incredible, and amazing Colorado history is and how deep it is, going back so many years. So, well, we may not be able to use the PowerPoint today.
Well, he's working on it.
All right.
He said it's the cable.
Oh. Well, no.
Did you ever reboot music line?
All right.
So,
I'll ask you another question.
well, I'll tell you what. Why don't I ask the audience a question?
Some folks got it.
Okay, and this question feeds into what I'm going to be talking about today. Okay, let's have a pop quiz. All right, every good talk starts with a pop quiz, am I right? And this will be on the test. So, the largest city in Colorado in 1893 was Denver. Okay? Can you tell me what was the second largest city?
Leadville.
Leadville, absolutely. And what was the third largest city?
Pueblo.
Central City?
Nope.
Idaho Springs.
Nope.
Turtle Creek.
Nope.
Colorado
Nope.
Springs.
Nope. 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 Georgetown. Georgetown was the third largest city. So what does that tell you? What was centered, what was the focus of work and employment in Leadville and Georgetown? Mining. What does that tell you about the center and the focus of Colorado's economy in 1893? Mining. So, since we were so dependent here in Colorado on that one industry, especially silver mining, and I'll go into why that is, when the silver crash happened during the summer and fall of 1893, it was a horrendous, horrible catastrophe for the state of Colorado and really all the mining-centered states in the western United States. So they all had to unite in some kind of response to this. They had all kinds of relief efforts going for the unemployed and all kinds of other endeavors to try to alleviate this, some of them kind of wacky and crazy. And let me go into a couple of those. Davis Waite was the populist governor of Colorado during the silver crash. He's a member of the Populist or People's Party, which we would probably consider today to be fairly left-wing and rather radical. So when the silver crash happened, he came up with some fascinating remedies for it. one of which was the Fandango dollars scheme. How are we doing?
Well, fine, except for not advancing.
Reboot your computer. No, serious. There you go.
There you go.
Oh, here we go. Okay, looks good. Hmm? Are we okay?
May I just say something?
Sure, go ahead.
The Silver Plume, Colorado, which is across the highway, basically, I-70 and on up, has a good museum. It's very interesting. And Silver Plume was named for the large silver strike. I'm not sure if it was one of the largest or not, but was shaped like a plume, a feather. And I found that to be very, very.
Silver Plume is a great place to visit when you want to learn about this time period. And the other, I would highly recommend people go up to Leadville if you're really interested.
I'm just going to have you use the arrow keys for now.
Okay, well, I'm going to put this here then, because I got my notes here on,
Oh, cover all.
yeah. Okay, let's see what we can do here. And does this work? Does it work?
No, you have to use the arrow key, he
You
said.
have to hit the arrow
Okay,
on the computer.
right-o. Is that on? Okay, so those of you who are thinking this isn't a military topic, check it out. Here's the state militia with their Gatling guns during the 1894 Cripple Creek strike. And if you don't get off on Gatling guns, there's something wrong with you. And
Custer didn't like them.
Unfortunately.
here is the state militia in battle formation during that same strike in 1894 up in Cripple Creek with their Gatling guns at the ready in the center of the line. Here they are. Here's the state militia in the foreground with their rifles. And if you can, they don't have the pointer. Here's their cannon, their artillery backup right here, which is an obsolete Civil War Napoleon gun, but it's still a cannon. And they're ready in case blood drenches the streets of Denver in 1894 during the Courthouse War. And then finally, I'm talking about this whole time period today. Here's the 1st Colorado Volunteer Infantry on top of the fortifications in Manila, Philippine Islands, where they were fighting during the Spanish-American War. So if you don't think this has some military aspects to it, you are sadly mistaken. Now, one of the things I emphasized right at the beginning was Colorado and its economy were totally different in 1893 from the situation today. Silver mining was the dominant driver of the Colorado economy in 1893. Thank you, thank you. I can use this to hit Bob Mulder over the head with. And Colorado was dubbed the Silver State. Georgetown was called the Silver Queen of cities, and the San Juan Mountains were called the Silvery San Juans. The great silver boom of the late 1870s through the early 1890s lasted a lot longer, about 15 years, than the original gold rush here in Colorado. And because it happened because it was a combination of government monetary policy. The government started buying silver as well as gold to back up the stability of the U.S. currency and economy. Massive silver deposits were discovered first up around the Leadville area and then in the Roaring Fork Valley and all over the place in the San Juan Mountains. So this is really what created, and also when railroad lines were built, this was the age of great railroad expansion in Colorado. The smelting industry was blasting full strength. So you had all kinds of industrial backup, and the economy was centered on the great Colorado silver boom. Okay, and if you can imagine, we usually think, when you think of mining, when you think of prospecting, when you think of looking for silver and gold here in Colorado, what comes to your mind? Flint Whitlock, what do you think of?
Sorry, I'm still on US 36. Actually, there's a big accident on 270 getting to the 36, and I apologize for being late. Would you repeat your question, please?
Flint, what do you think of? When you think of looking, searching for gold and silver in Colorado, what's in your fevered imagination when you think of that?
Well, I think it's very difficult,
Okay.
first of all, to find, we got thousands of square miles of mountains and places where gold could be hidden. So, it takes a lot of intelligence to figure it out.
And I think in most people's minds, you're thinking of the prospector out there with his gold pan, right? Or the sluice.
Placer mining.
Yeah, exactly. Well, this is the reality of mining in Colorado in 1893. It's a gigantic industrial operation. And this is, by the way, the Arkansas smelter up in Leadville. And just looking at this picture gives you an image of the ravaged industrial landscape all around the mining areas of Colorado and what that looked like. Check out all those noxious fumes coming out of the Arkansas smelter. And those are noxious. Those are arsenic, all kinds of poisonous chemicals involved, not only in the fumes and smoke coming out of the smelter, but also in what's going into the ground as a byproduct. So this is the reality of mining in Colorado in 1893. When vast silver deposits were discovered up around Leadville, in the San Juan Mountains, in the Roaring Fork Valley, we have hundreds of new communities being created during that time period. Leadville, Aspen, Durango, Silverton, Telluride, Ouray, Creed, all of these communities were created in the 1880s and very early 1890s, all because of silver and silver mining. A lot of people were enduring hard times in the 1880s and early 1890s. And mainly one of the big reasons was the very tight money supply here in the United States. During the Civil War, the Union government had issued hundreds of thousands, well, actually hundreds of millions of dollars in greenbacks, which were dollars, paper dollars that were unbacked up by gold or silver, just to finance the Union war effort. And that caused heavy inflation. There was a lot of money in circulation, and we were issuing silver dollars. In 1873, the United States government stopped minting silver dollars and stopped buying silver as well as gold to back up the economy. So that was known as the crime of '73 to those who advocated silver. So since then, a lot of different organizations had been urging the U.S. government to resume buying silver and minting silver dollars. And this was known as the Agrarian Revolt, the farmers' revolt of the 1880s, because there was only about $20 in circulation for every single person in the United States. There was severe deflation. Farm prices were low. And if you were a farmer who had borrowed money or mortgaged your property before this really hit, and then you found money so hard to come by to pay your loans back, this was a severe issue for them. So there were a lot of organizations. There was the Farmers Alliances, there was the Grange, all kinds of different organizations, the Greenback Party, to try to bring silver back into its dominance. And silver became seen as the people's metal. Okay, silver was the people's metal. Gold was the metal of the wealthy, the plutocrats, the capitalists, those who were preying on the farmers and the ordinary people of America. So there began to be this divide, silver versus gold. The Populist Party, or what was officially known as the People's Party, was founded in 1892. And all these different political organizations that had been founded by farmers and workers to try to bring silver back in more prominence in our economy, they all coalesced with the Populist Party in 1892. And one of the urging things that the Populist Party wanted to do was to expand the money supply, enabling the farmers and the other debtors to pay off their debts. How are they going to do this? Silver, the people's metal. Government, start buying more silver and use silver to mint more silver coinage, expand the money supply, and save and salvage all these people who are working so hard to try to survive. So this was one of the big things that was happening. And here in Colorado, we latched onto this big time. In 1892, James Weaver, the populist candidate for president, came to Colorado along with Mary Lease, who was a very famous populist orator. She was known as the Kansas Pythoness. The Kansas Pythoness. Pythoness. So what does that mean? Was she kind of snaky and sneaky and slimy? No. This was a reference, the ancient Greek oracle of Delphi was sometimes known as the Pythoness, because Delphi is where Apollo killed the monstrous snake, the python. So the Delphi oracle, she was known as the Pythoness. So Mary Lease was the modern oracle, the modern Pythoness. And they came to Denver in 1892 to speak. 10,000 people gathered to hear them speak. Weaver got the majority of the presidential vote that year, not only in Colorado, but in 4 other western states. Now, what happens when you keep producing more and more and more and more of a product while the supply is outpacing the demand? What happens in that case?
The value drops.
The price goes down. So as the 1880s wore on, the price of silver started to drop, drop, drop. Who's going to ride to the rescue to help us out with this? None other than Buffalo Bill Cody. Rides to the rescue. In 1886, he held a silver benefit at the McClellan Opera House in Georgetown, and there were more than 60 silver clubs founded in Colorado at this time. What were they raising money for? Lobbying, right? Lobbying Congress to bring back some aspect to create more demand for silver. And this is what actually eventually happens. In 1890, Senator John Sherman of Ohio, the brother of General William Tecumseh Sherman, a proud Buckeye like myself, if I might say, he introduced the 1890 Sherman Silver Purchase Act that required the U.S. Treasury to buy 4.5 million ounces of silver every month. So that's a lot of silver. Now, this is great. The price of silver shoots up. This is wonderful for the silver mining industry, the smelting industry, the railroad industry, the mechanics. Everybody who works on the silver mines is happy. There's rainbows and unicorns. But there's one big flaw in the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. Okay, now if you sold silver bullion to the U.S. Treasury through this act, you could choose to be paid in silver dollars or you could be paid in gold dollars. Which one would you choose? Of course you would choose gold coming out of the U.S. Treasury. And this started to drain gold out of the Treasury. And of course, those speculators and investors who did that would melt those dollars down and sell the gold bullion on foreign markets. This was also a time of financial instability internationally. In 1890, the Baring Brothers Bank in London, which was one of the largest banks in the world, had invested in Argentine wheat. And that year, the Argentine wheat crop failed, and there was political instability in Argentina. So the Baring Brothers Bank in 1890 was threatening to go under. And this would have caused a total international financial crash. Now, they were eventually bailed out by the Bank of Russia and the Bank of France. But foreign investors in U.S. government bonds were spooked, and they asked to cash in their bonds and be paid in gold. So through the Sherman Act and through that situation, gold began draining out of the U.S. Treasury. And eventually it got to the situation where there was less than $100 million worth of gold in the Treasury. And that was the stated minimum that had to be there for the stability of the United States government and the economy. So this, because of the Sherman Act and other factors, this is a crisis. Now in 1893 in April, two of the biggest corporations in the United States, the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad and the National Cordage Company, went into bankruptcy and receivership. They had overextended themselves in expanding, not keeping enough cash on hand to pay their creditors. The creditors came calling, they went into bankruptcy, and this plunged the country into a depression called the Panic of 1893. And this was the biggest and the worst crash since until Black Thursday in 1929. 65 railroad companies, including the mighty Union Pacific, would go into bankruptcy during this panic. It was horrible. So we're already in the middle of a catastrophic national depression. Then what happens? We're hoping in Colorado that at least because of silver, it will help us through this national depression. But in June of 1893, a committee of the British Parliament called the Herschel Committee recommended that the government of India stop minting silver rupees and go on the gold standard like the rest of the British Empire. India had been one of the biggest buyers of American silver, and this was a huge, huge catastrophe for the mining industry in America. By June 30th, headlines in the Leadville Herald Democrat screamed, "The mines close down." The economic devastation snowballed until by September it was reported that 377 businesses had failed, 435 mines closed, and 45,000 people were unemployed. In Denver, 10,000 unemployed, desperate men roamed the streets seeking relief or work. As many as 25,000 Denver citizens fled the city to find work elsewhere, and the listing of foreclosures filled 73 pages in the Rocky Mountain News. This is how
How many pages?
73 pages in the newspaper of foreclosures. This is how bad it was. Now, it got worse. A bill to repeal the Sherman Silver Purchase Act was introduced into Congress, and it was supported by President Grover Cleveland and many advocates of the gold standard. The repeal bill passed the House and debate began in the Senate. And as you can see, it was an on and off proposition. The last flimsy firewall for silver seemed ready to collapse. Now this, led by Senator Henry Teller down here, who had been senator since 1876, all the senators from the western silver mining states, whether they were Democrats, Republicans, or populists, banded together to filibuster the repeal bill. Through every devious maneuver they could devise, they managed to delay passage of the bill for an astounding 46 days. But finally, in October of 1893, the bill passed, and the last bulwark of defense for silver collapsed. The silver crash tsunami rolled over Colorado and the rest of the silver mining West. The repeal completed the devastation of the market for silver. All of Colorado's silver mines and smelters shut down, and the ripple effects caused massive unemployment and misery. Now, in 1892, we had elected a populist governor, Davis H. Waite, a patriarchal, gentle-looking gentleman. However, he had a fiery temper, and he was very impulsive. So one of the things he tried as relief to the silver crash was the Fandango Dollars scheme. And what this was, what he proposed, that Colorado's silver be sent to Mexico to be minted into silver pesos, which would then be returned to Colorado to reinforce the amount of money in circulation and bring back wealth to Colorado. And some folks from the U.S. Treasury pointed out to him this was totally illegal and unconstitutional. And so the Fandango dollar scheme went down the tubes, but there was a tremendous amount of ridicule toward him for having proposed this. The other thing he proposed was that the state issue scrip. Okay, and scrip, a lot of corporations issued scrip, like mining companies would issue it as pay to their workers, and it could be spent in the company store. So the scrip could be redeemed, and you could pay for things with it, and then somehow it would be paid back later. And again, this was impractical, so it was shot down also. So he's trying to find some solutions. Now, in 1894, we run into a really drastic situation. He had, in those days, under the Colorado Constitution, the governor could appoint members of the Denver Police Board. And he had appointed 2 members who it turned out were corrupt and were in league with Soapy Smith and the gambling elements in Denver, and were allowing illegal gambling to happen all over the place. So when Waite found out about this, he fired the 2 men he had appointed. And they said, no, you didn't. So they barricaded themselves in City Hall. They enlisted the entire corrupt Denver Police Department to support them, plus hundreds of thugs led by Soapy Smith. And they all holed up in the City Hall, armed with Winchester rifles and dynamite, and said, come and get us. So Governor Waite was a little bit disturbed by this. And he tried negotiating for a couple of days, but that didn't work. And eventually, he called out the state militia, and here they are. I showed you this before, lined up, and there were hundreds of them mobilized, plus a company of the 7th Infantry from Fort Logan, backed up by cannon and Gatling guns, ready to blow the courthouse to smithereens. Now, think about this, folks. You're a sensible person, right? If there was a risk of bloody, horrible violence happening, would you go right to the spot where it was going to happen? Would you do that? No. Well, the people of Denver in 1893 thought differently. So thousands of people flocked to downtown Denver near the courthouse to enjoy the spectacle of carnage and bloodshed that they expected was about to ensue. But it didn't happen. After a few days, Governor Waite calmed down, called off the militia, and that same day, the Colorado Supreme Court ruled that he was correct in removing these two scumbags from office, and so he was justified, and the crisis ended. But another one started up right away. But I should backtrack a little bit and say, amid all this horrible situation, there was a bright spot. In November of 1893, a majority of Coloradans in a national or in a statewide referendum agreed that women should be allowed to vote in national, local, and state elections. Now, previously, Utah and Wyoming had granted women the right to vote through the state legislature. But here in Colorado, we were the first state to give women the right to vote through a statewide popular referendum by a vote of the people. Yes, Flint?
Women get to vote on that referendum?
No. No. Thank you for upsetting the apple cart, Flint Whitlock. No. No, they did not get to vote in the referendum, but they got to vote in every election thereafter. So this was a revolution. And there had been previous attempts in 1876 and 1877. Elizabeth Cady Stanton came out, one of the great national proponents of the women's right to vote. But at that time, it failed. But by 1893, women had become very powerful in the Colorado economy. This was supported by very wealthy women like Mrs. Crawford Hill and Baby Doe Tabor. And so the women were very influential. There was a very important newspaper in Denver called the Queen Bee, which had an all-female staff. And of course, they crusaded for it too. There were very famous women journalists by this time, and it passed. And proudly we can say we're the first state where women gained the vote by popular vote. So Denver was overwhelmed. The charity organizations in Denver, like the People's Tabernacle Mission, led by Reverend Thomas Uzzell. Who does he look like? He looks like... These charities, the Catholic charities, the Jewish charities, all of the charitable organizations were overwhelmed by the tremendous amount of unemployed who were seeking help. So in the middle of this catastrophe, people looked to spiritual help. And the person they looked to above all others was Francis Schlatter. Okay, Francis Schlatter was originally from Alsace-Lorraine. He was working in Denver as a cobbler, a shoemaker. And then he received, he said, a call from the Father to go on a pilgrimage in New Mexico. And when he came back, he announced he had healing powers. So if people would come to him, he would lay hands on them, he would pray with them, and he would heal whatever ailment they were suffering from. And thousands of people, here he is, this is out in the rain, here he is laying hands on a gentleman and praying with him. Was he really able to heal people's ailments? Well, that's kind of up in the air. But just the fact that you came to a person who would, in a gentle voice, speak with you, pray with you, try to heal you and give you sympathy for whatever you were suffering from, undoubtedly had a lot of effect on people. And many people said they were helped from their pain and illness by him. So this is one of the ways that people tried to get relief from the suffering they were going through with this terrible catastrophe. Eventually, he left. After only a few months in Denver, he left and said the Father had told him to go elsewhere and establish a city of God. And apparently he went down into the New Mexico mountains. He may have died there. Some of his belongings were found there, but nobody is actually sure whatever happened to Francis Schlatter after his sojourn in Denver. Another big group of unemployed arrived in Denver in 1894, and this was Coxey's Army, otherwise known as the Army of the Commonwealth of Christ. Now, Jacob Coxey was a successful businessman in Massillon, Ohio, and everyone knows that all important and influential people come out of Ohio, right? I mean, come on. So Coxey had the idea of the first March on Washington. He called this a crusade in boots, and he urged unemployed people from all across the country to get organized, to travel to Washington, D.C. by May 1st, 1895, and ask Congress for relief work. What he had in mind was basically the CCC and the WPA, but 40 years before those things happened, to rebuild the country's roadways, bridges, and in return, the government would expand the silver currency, here we go again, in order to pay them. And the largest contingent of Coxey's, oh, and by the way, my grandmother, who was born in 1882, remembered the guys from Coxey's Army marching through my hometown of Hamilton, Ohio. So the largest contingent of Coxey's Army gathered in Denver. There was a relief camp set up for them along the Platte River in Denver. And eventually, though, people in Denver got tired of feeding and supporting this group of people. So the Chamber of Commerce donated lumber for them to build rafts and float down the Platte River. And here they are building their rafts. So the scheme was they would float down the Platte, the South Platte River, to the main channel of the Platte River in Nebraska, and then float down the Platte River to Kansas City and try to get rail transportation to the east. And believe it or not, about 25 guys actually made it to Kansas City, where their treasurer stole and ran off with all their money. So, and what eventually happened with this, about 400 men actually did manage to make it to D.C. on May 1st. And Coxey and one of his associates walked up the steps of the Capitol to read their petition to Congress, and they were arrested for trespassing and stepping on the grass of the Capitol. and put into jail for about 90 days, and so the whole thing collapsed. But that's what happened at Coxey's army. We got to talk, if we're talking about the silver crash, we have to talk about two legendary characters, Horace Tabor and his second wife, the lovely Baby Doe. Horace and his first wife, Augusta, had been traveling around Colorado ever since the gold rush of 1859, running little general stores and prospecting here and there. In about 1877, he grub-staked two German prospectors up in Oro City, which was located near where Leadville is now, and they struck it rich in what was called the Little Pittsburgh Mine. And because of his interest in that mine through his grub-stake to them, he became a millionaire. He bought the Matchless Mine and the Chrysolite Mine. He became a multi-millionaire through the investments in those mines. He dumped his first wife, the faithful, loving, and intelligent Augusta Tabor, in favor of the lovely but somewhat lacking in brain power Baby Doe. And the Matchless Mine had become less productive as time went on. Some of his other investments didn't turn out with any kind of a profit. He had to lease his real estate holdings in Denver. He was in somewhat shaky financial state already, and then the silver crash hit. And he lost, basically he and Baby Doe lost everything. But they stayed together. Baby Doe stuck with him. By 1893, 1894, they were living in a little shack up in Nederland, and he had gone back to prospecting with his gold pan. Eventually, Horace was rescued when he was appointed the postmaster of Denver, which is a well-paying job. He and Baby Doe and their two daughters are living in the Brown Palace. He was making some successful investments, and there were articles in the newspaper saying, Tabor's coming back. He's going to be a very wealthy man again. And then in 1899, he died of appendicitis. So, but the legend of Baby Doe lives on. There have been all kinds of novels and books written about them. There was an opera written called The Ballad of Baby Doe. And so the legend lives on. How are we going to rescue ourselves in the midst of all this disaster? Well, the rescue came through one particular person, James Joseph Brown. J.J. Brown was the manager of the Ibex mining properties in Leadville. And he had a hunch that in back of the silver deposits in the Little Johnny mine, there might be gold deposits back there. Now, people had tried to mine back there, but it was very sandy, shifting soil. It kept collapsing. And they couldn't get back into the mountain where they felt that the gold was located. J.J. Brown came up with an ingenious method of building supports, wooden supports, for bales of hay up above, and that prevented the sandy soil from filtering down and collapsing, and he was able to get further back into the mountain and found the richest gold deposits in the entire world in the back of the Little Johnny mine. So Leadville and the Colorado economy began to recover because of this. And J.J. Brown was given so many shares of Ibex mining stock, he became a millionaire. He and his wife, Maggie Brown, moved to Denver, bought a beautiful house on Pennsylvania Avenue that you can still visit today as the Molly Brown House. Okay, nobody ever called Mrs. Brown Molly during her entire life. They came out of the stupid musical. But anyway, that's it. And so Colorado was somewhat on the road to recovery. And this caused a second gold rush in Colorado, especially in Jefferson County. This is the Anna L. Gold Mine. There was a new community founded near the mine called Critchell. Okay, and that's gone today. It's a ghost town, but until the gold deposits ran out within a few years, these new communities in Jefferson County were producing quite a bit of gold and were prosperous communities. So gold mining communities like Idaho Springs, Central City, Black Hawk, and the new town of Cripple Creek were flourishing in the middle of this new gold rush of the 1890s. Is there a fly in the ointment?
Always.
Maybe if we could see it. 1894, the mine owners in Cripple Creek pulled a bad move. What they did, they announced to the miners, now since the silver crash had started, the miners were usually making $3 a day. But the mine owners said, nope, because of the silver crash, we're going to cut this back to $2.50 a day, which is quite a loss of income. And then in Cripple Creek, they said, we're moving this from an 8-hour day to a 10-hour day, guys. The miners of the Western Federation of Miners Union said, well, wait a minute, if you're going to do that, why don't you at least bring the wage back up to $3 a day? Mine owners said no. So the miners struck. The mines that weren't striking were locked down by the owners, and this was the beginning of the Great Cripple Creek Strike of 1894. This turned into a very violent affair. The mine owners, instead of negotiating with the union, which they refused to do, the mine owners started hiring a private army of deputies, arming them with Winchester rifles, and they eventually gathered about 1,200 of these guys, unemployed men during the silver crash. This is the, if you can see it, this is the African American company, because even the deputies, quote, deputies, private army was segregated. There's a little bit interesting wrinkle on this. Governor Waite was alarmed at the possibility of bloodshed. The deputies tried to move into Cripple Creek by rail. The miners blew up the Strong Mine, which was located right near the tracks, showering the deputies with debris. The deputies wisely retreated back up the track, followed up by the miners. There was a gun battle. A man on either side was killed. Many were wounded. Governor Waite sent in the state militia to try to keep order. Waite negotiated on behalf of the miners with the mine owners and finally came up with a resolution that was fairly favorable to the miners. This was announced. The miners disarm, they start a big celebration. Then the word comes, the private army is advancing toward where the miners were holed up on Bull Hill, where they had a little fort built. General Brooks, who was in charge of the state militia, rolled out the Gatling guns and formed up the state militia and told the deputies, if you don't step down and go back to your camp, we're going to open fire on you. So they looked at the Gatling guns, which could fire 700 to 800 rounds a minute, and said, well, maybe it's kind of bad weather. You know, I think my foot kind of hurts. So they went back to their camp, and Governor Waite, through using the state militia and his negotiations, had saved the day and prevented more violence from happening. And he was rewarded with re-election, right? Not. He was overwhelmingly defeated. For re-election, Governor Albert McIntyre, a Republican, was elected in his place. Waite was blamed for the courthouse war. He was blamed for the Fandango dollar scheme, the scrip relief scheme, and for the violence in Cripple Creek, and he was defeated for re-election. 2 years later in Leadville, the same situation develops for the exact same reasons. So the miners go on strike, and this was an extremely deadly and destructive and vicious strike in Leadville. It got to the point where both, again, a private army of deputies was hired by the mine owners. The miners imported several hundred Marlin lever-action repeating rifles. The situation was developing into an extremely volatile one. And finally, the Coronado mine, which was actually located within Leadville, was blown up and burned down by the miners. Firemen who tried to hook up their fire hoses to hydrants were shot down and killed. At least 6 men and several dozen wounded were casualties of this horrible violence. Several of the other mines were attacked, including the Emmett mine, which you can see up here is being guarded by a gentleman from the state militia. So Governor McIntyre called out the militia, and what they did was restore order, but the most important thing they did, the mine owners started importing strike breakers who were lead miners unemployed from Missouri. And the state militia protected the strike breakers. So in this kind of situation, the Union could not win. The hundreds of strike breakers kept coming in to operate the mines, protected by the militia. There were several other deaths that happened as a result of altercations, but the Union lost. The Union lost this strike. And this left a terrible legacy behind it. Now, it was inevitable that this all was going to evolve into the political arena. Okay? And this came to a head in 1896 during the 1896 presidential season. The battle over silver split the two major political parties. The question of a bimetallic standard using gold and silver to guarantee the government's solvency, or the gold standard, using only gold for that purpose, would define the presidential election of 1896. At the Republican National Convention in July in St. Louis, former Ohio Congressman, again, everybody important comes from Ohio, folks, come on. Former Ohio Congressman and Governor William McKinley was nominated on the first ballot, a triumph engineered by McKinley's genius campaign manager and best friend, Mark Hanna. The Republican platform stressed high tariffs, the gold standard, and support for the Cuban rebels fighting for independence from Spain. When this platform was adopted, delegates from the western silver states, led by Senator Henry Teller, our senator, walked out of the convention and bolted the Republican Party, forming their own Silver Republican Party. Now, when the Democrats met in Chicago a month later, there were several possible candidates. Silver advocates had gained tremendously in local elections, but defenders of the gold standard and President Grover Cleveland still held considerable power. Who would the Democratic candidate be? The answer came on the second day of the convention, when after two lackluster speakers defending the gold standard, a 38-year-old former congressman from Nebraska, still the youngest man ever to run for president, bounded up the steps to the speaker's platform. Tremendous cheers from the 10,000 people there at the convention. Taking a pose like an ancient Roman gladiator, William Jennings Bryan quieted the raucous crowd and began one of the most influential speeches in American history. asserting the equality of Americans, farmers, miners, crossroads merchants, and village lawyers with their wealthy urban counterparts, Bryan extolled the virtues of the hardworking pioneers of the plains. Then he launched into it the attack on the gold standard advocates, ending with the immortal peroration, "You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." So there was a very short silence, and then the entire convention erupted into madness. The 10,000 delegates sang, wept, shouted, and screamed as they paraded to the cacophony of brass bands. The demonstration continued for nearly an hour, and it was clear that William Jennings Bryan would be the Democratic candidate for president. Now, at the Populist Party convention, and here's Senator Teller, by the way, bolting the Republican Party and bringing the other silver delegates with him. The cantankerous and highly individualistic populists literally fought. The Texas delegation drew their 6-shooters. There were fistfights over whether they would also nominate Bryan and his Democratic running mate, Arthur Sewell. The Democratic platform echoed many of the demands of the Populist Party. In the end, they made the worst decision they could possibly make. They nominated Bryan for president, but one of their own, Tom Watson, Congressman Tom Watson of Georgia, as their vice presidential candidate, thus saddling Bryan with 2 different vice presidential candidates. And throughout the campaign, he was ridiculed by the Republicans because of that. Now, the campaign that followed revealed the differing personalities of the candidates. Bryan embarked on a series of whistle-stop rail journeys that would eventually cover more than 80,000 miles. He often spoke to audiences more than 10,000 people, would give more than 600 speeches, plus hundreds of smaller whistle-stop appearances. Here he is in Westerville, Ohio. Where else would you go? And by the way, with his wife, Mary, who is also an attorney, extremely smart and shrewd politically, and she was his main political advisor. Okay? How do you feel about that, Mary? Okay. All right. Now, in contrast, McKinley and his wife, Ida, stayed home in Canton, Ohio, at their modest home there, and invited people to come and visit them. And cheap railroad fares were given out to go to Canton, and then the saying was, it was cheaper to visit McKinley than stay at home. More than 750,000 people visited Canton during the campaign to be greeted by the McKinleys. This was called the Front Porch Campaign, in a quiet domestic setting rather than a crowded, noisy, rowdy political gathering. So what happened? On Election Day, McKinley narrowly defeated Bryan. Colorado had given Bryan, Silver's great defender, almost 85% of the presidential vote. 85% of the voters here in Colorado voted for Bryan. With an enormous campaign chest and donations from the nation's leading financiers and industrialists, people like John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, Andrew Carnegie, etc., contributed heavily to the Republicans. The Republicans had swamped the impecunious Democrats with masses of campaign literature and plenty of voter intimidation from employers. Undaunted, the Democrats prepared for another struggle in 1900, and it was certain that William Jennings Bryan would be their candidate. So, While labor issues, political controversy, and the lingering effects of the silver crash preoccupied Coloradans, a much different conflict was about to erupt, a shooting war. Americans were extremely sympathetic to the plight of the Cuban and Filipino rebels fighting for their independence from Spain. There was popular revulsion against the brutal retaliation by Spanish army and officials. Everything literally exploded when the cruiser USS Maine blew up in Havana Harbor on February 15, 1898. Though the cause of the explosion has never been officially determined, the American public assumed that the Spanish had done it, and the cry went up, "Remember the Maine, the hell with Spain. Everybody, come on, let's do it. Remember the Maine, the hell with Spain." There it is. And on April 18th, 1898, the United States declared war on Spain. Coloradans responded enthusiastically, offering a full infantry regiment and 2 cavalry troops. Now, Colorado even had its own battle song to the tune of Marching Through Georgia. Okay, and the chorus went something like this. Hurrah, hurrah, we won't forget the Maine. Goodbye, goodbye, old yellow rag of Spain. So we sang the chorus from the mountain and the plain as we were marching to Cuba. Okay. Now, everybody assumed, well, the Coloradans are going to be sent to Cuba along with Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders, right? Wrong. President McKinley determined it was in the best interest of the United States to take control of the Philippine Islands. First Colorado Volunteer Infantry departed Denver for the Philippines on May 17th amid a tumultuous send-off in Denver. After they arrived near Manila, they were among the first to storm the city's fortifications as their band played. There'll be a hot time in the old town tonight. Although the war ended with total Spanish defeat on August 12th, the Coloradans were kept in the Philippines until September 1899, fighting the Filipinos, who rebelled against their new colonial overlords and former allies. So by 1900, Colorado's economy had revived, but silver was never to have the same importance. The festival in Mountain and Plain was held in Denver to celebrate the recovery. It was held from about 1896 to about 1912 every year, and this was a huge festival that ran for about 2 weeks. And by the way, this is the Zhang's Brewery float in the parade. You know, Native people were brought in to do their dances. There were several parades. There was a special Masonic type fraternity founded to run the parades and the festival. It was just an amazing event to celebrate the recovery from the silver crash. So after President McKinley was assassinated in 1901, 43-year-old Theodore Roosevelt became president. A new man for a new century, fighting against the big corporations on behalf of conserving our national resources. Roosevelt brought a whole new dimension to the presidency in the issues, the ideas, the results of the silver crash began to fade into the background as Roosevelt took over as president. The bitter hatred between labor and management that began during the silver crash led to the Colorado Labor War of 1903-1904. This is one of the dead miners lying on the railroad tracks who was killed during the labor war of those years, and eventually to the Ludlow Massacre of 1914. So this was one of the bitter, terrible legacies of the silver crash. Now, many of the old mining towns have reinvented themselves. If you think of Telluride, Ouray, Aspen. They've reinvented themselves through the ski industry, summer festivals, or Cripple Creek and Black Hawk and Central City through gambling. So some have managed to survive and thrive. Others, not so much. Hundreds of communities. Teller City, Animas Forks, Independence, all of these have faded away into ghost towns, and as far as many of them are concerned, there's nothing left today. So if you go to one of these ghost towns like Animas Forks here today, and you walk around and you wonder, what devastated this community? How did it devolve into just a ghost town? What happened here? What was the cause of all this? You might hear, if you listen in the wind, a little voice saying, "The silver crash." So, that's what happened. Now, I might also say I have a few copies of my book on Colorado and the Civil War with me today, and if you would like to buy a copy, I can send it for you. Otherwise, I am done.
Have a brief moment for a couple of questions. If folks would like to ask John some questions.
Well, of course, Flint Whitlock has a question.
How did Leadville get its name? Did they mine lead there? Why didn't it become Goldville or Silverville?
I can answer that, believe it or not, Flint.
I set you up for this.
Well, you know, one of the things that impeded mining and prospecting in Leadville over the years was the sluices and gold pans and rockers and what they were using up there were clogged up by this black gunk. And for years, people were wondering, what the heck is this stuff? Well, about 1876, two mining developers who were looking around for prospects in the area looked at this stuff and said, what the heck is this? And they finally took it to an assay office, and the assayer told us this is granulated lead ore, but it's full of granulated silver ore, indicating there are massive deposits of silver around the area where you found this. This was the first clue as to what this stuff was. That's why it's called Leadville, and that's why silver mining got so developed up there. Yes.
Yeah, I had a question. The silver dollar, they began doing that in 1878, and they stopped in 1904, and then they started again in 1921 and ended in 1935. What was the reason for that they had that gap?
Well, they stopped in 1873 because of the national depression of that year. They wanted to stabilize and go to gold coinage and the gold standard for the U.S. government. And they started again in 1878 because of all the lobbying efforts by silver mining advocates, the silver industry. So that's what started it then. Now, in 1921 through 1930, one of the reasons they started up again, silver began to be more important in the early 1930s because what happened in 1933 in the United States. So while somebody took over as the president in 1933, FDR, and FDR wanted to boost us out of the Depression any way he could. Many things he tried failed, other things worked. And one of the things he tried was boosting the silver industry up again. Now the 20s, I'm not sure. I can't really tell you, but I can tell you why it happened in the early 30s, really kind of through World War II. Yeah.
Any idea of why the referendum on women's voting happened in 1893?
Yeah, because there was a tremendous pressure that had built over the years. When it failed in the 1870s, people were very disappointed. But by 1893, women had become much more powerful, both in terms of journalism, their writings. People like Caroline Churchill, who was the editor of the Queen Bee, were very well regarded and respected as journalists. Wealthy women. In 1877, how many wealthy women were there in Colorado? Probably zero, but by 1893, had people like Baby Doe Tabor, Mrs. Crawford Hill, Molly Brown, who didn't want to be pushed into the background anymore and told they couldn't vote. You know, I can buy and sell you 10 times over. Who are you to tell me I can't vote? So the pressure was big in 1893, and that's why it happened then.
I've heard in some other places, I think Wyoming, that they wanted more votes. Somebody wanted more votes.
Well, Wyoming already had votes for women. They had since the 1870s, and also Utah. But those were votes through the state legislature, not through a vote of the people at large. So that's why it was so important here.
Wasn't one of the first women to serve in Congress from Wyoming? or
Yes,
Montana?
that's correct,
Wyoming.
yeah. Mhm.
Long before women's suffrage became general.
Yeah, and in here, yeah. So, yes.
Just an interesting comment on when Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton met in July of 1848, in Seneca Falls, New York. And this is where the women's suffrage movement began. It wasn't really intended for the right to vote. They were trying to get women's rights so that if they inherited property, it stayed with them. Because otherwise, any property a woman inherited belonged to her husband, and he could do with it what he pleased. She had no say. That's how that started. In the back of that first meeting in the auditorium, a young man who was in law school came in just out of interest. There was a lot of interest in this. Most women were forbidden to even attend by their husbands. That man went on to become, it's either the judge or something in Wyoming, and he was the one who signed the bill to give women the right to vote. Just kind of a
Interesting connection there, yeah. Well, there's another way in which women gained independence during this time period, and that's through a Boston marriage. You might hear that sometimes it was called a Wellesley marriage, because Wellesley was the women's college. Okay. And what a Boston marriage or a Wellesley marriage was two well-educated women living together, owning a house and living together over a long period of years. So now, if people looking at that today say, oh, they were lesbians. Well, not necessarily, because what they were doing was not getting married deliberately, because if they got married, what would happen to their legal status? Their husbands would basically be in charge of running their lives and owning everything. They preferred to get together with another woman that they were compatible with, own a house, and be involved in journalism or politics or whatever, and be independent rather than depending on their husband.
So single women could inherit property, but married women couldn't?
Married women, generally, if you inherited, the property would be under the authority of your husband. It wouldn't necessarily be theirs legally, but they would have the authority over what to do with it.
The
So,
Boston marriage was kind of behind the concept of spinsterhood, wasn't that part of it too?
yeah, you would stay single because you didn't want to surrender your independence to some guy. Like, why would you want to marry Bob Mulder? I mean, come on, that'd be silly. So, anyway.
Well, folks, I want to thank you very much for coming in today. And John, as an appreciation here from the museum, I can't say that it's made out of real silver. But we do have a challenge coin for you, and thank you, sir, for
Thank you.
speaking
Thank
and
you.
informing us about the silver thread.
Thank you so much.
All right, as John mentioned, he does have some books if you are
Oh, yeah.
interested in those. So I will let you guys come on up if you want to talk.
Whoop.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, Don.
I got a quick question for you.
Sure, yeah.
My wife, I won't bore you with all the details, my wife's great-grandfather was a major businessman in Cripple Creek. We have no idea